Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at Felix Guattari's Molecular Revolutions and Q&A from the 1975 Schizo Culture event that was put on by Semiotext and can be found in the volume Schizo Culture, the Event. This is an interesting essay just for cementing the relationship that Guattari and Deleuze, by extension's work, has to politics. Guattari, in his very inflated and very complex vocabulary, talks to us about what it means to be revolutionary. And this is something that can often be a very vapid subject in academic discourse, talking about what does it mean to be revolutionary, the whole praxis versus theory divide or question and whatnot. It leads to a bunch of people just pontificating about, oh, I'm a cooler intellectual, or I know how to, rouse more confused feelings and whatnot. But I think that this is a good place to start in terms of thinking about the political implications of philosophical thought. Guattari mentions at the start that he sees a molecular revolution brimming and asks how it can be achieved. And he says that there are two possibilities for the outcome of such a molecular revolution. And when we say molecular revolution, we're talking about one pole of the binary of the molar and molecular. The molar is basically the macro and molecular the micro. Now, that is too simplistic, and I've talked about this before in some of my lectures on anti-oedipus, but it doesn't necessarily have to do with scale so much as the way that things function. In the molar, things are statistical, they are abstract, they are subsumed under certain basic axioms, they are hierarchical or arborescent, as Deleuze and Guattari put it, whereas molecular is more individual conscious, it is multiplicitous, it is rhizomatic, it doesn't necessarily attempt to make hierarchies. And kind of using this implicit binarization, he says that there are basically two possibilities for the molecular revolution. Either, one, political objectives are the echo of all kinds of struggles and are associated with an analysis of the phenomena of desire and of the social unconscious within the present organization, or two, the bureaucratic impasses and recuperations will necessarily recur. The desire of the masses and of interest groups will go through representatives and result from a representation. Now, of course, if we know anything about Deleuze and Guattari's work, we know that representation is something that they want to critique from a philosophical perspective. This is going back to the pragmatists, to Heidegger, to, even in early parts of Deleuze's work, focusing on critiquing an approach to epistemology that treats mental representations as the primary source of knowledge. The primary point from which we can achieve sure knowledge is the coherence of mental representations within the mind. This sort of weds us to an idealist paradigm. And this notion that we have to go through some sort of representative is something here that Guattari thinks may be politically advantageous for those who don't want desire to be able to manifest itself properly. Because in this latter one, in which bureaucratic impasses and recuperations necessarily recur, revolutionary desire, he says, is turned into organizational microfascism. And the idea of microfascism is a very important one, because this shows in a very concrete way the way that the molecular is emphasized in Guattari and Deleuze's work. Because oftentimes, for example, we talk about the culture or society or the state or fascism. And we talk about these things as if they're monoliths. One way that you might hear this kind of contested is in religious studies, where we talk about, for example, Christianity. But a lot of philosophers and religious studies scholars prefer to talk about Christianities. Because when we talk about Christianity, we necessarily assume that there is one coherent narrative that is basically dogma, that is orthodox, and the others are unorthodox or are lackluster in some sense. We hierarchize our notion of value of Christianity instead of understanding that Christianity is not a monolith. There are various different types and sects and beliefs and interpretive schemas and ways of approaching religious experience and all this, and none of them are necessarily more absolutely great than the other. We can see that the notion of which Christianity is the Christianity, is simply Christianity, is a political one. And in fact, that's the sort of thing that Guattari wants to bring out in the molecular approach, is instead of thinking about just fascism, we now think about microfascisms. We think about the way that fascism is not some sort of, think about the way reason works in Hegel's philosophy of history. Reason is some sort of transcendent faculty that pushes history forward. It is a logos of sorts that kind of floats over and also through history and allows it to continue moving. And it's some sort of faculty which can be transcended from the historical particulars. This is basically God for Hegel, in a very Christian sort of way, right? Where God is the Logos, He is the Word, He is the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost. Whereas Guattari wants to see fascism not as some sort of transcendent faculty that just moves and develops, but rather a collection of a number of microfascisms, of a number of micro-tendencies, which on their own might seem benign, but when they come together, lead to a lot of problems. As such, he says that if we really want to understand modern society, for example, like societies of control that Deleuze talks about in the essay that I've done a lecture on here, he talks about the semiotic subjugation of all individuals, which is kind of emblematic of modern society. Children begin learning about capitalism in the cradle before they have access to speech. They learn to perceive capitalist objects and relations on television, through the family, in the nursery. If they somehow manage to escape semiotic subjugation, then specialized institutions are there to take care of them. Psychology, psychoanalysis, to name two. So these institutions serve to recoup and essentially correct for desire that has erred outside of the bounds necessary for capitalism, necessary for a certain mode of production. And this is why Guattari and Deleuze as well are deeply wedded to Marxist thought in certain regards, that we can see history as a sort of paradigmatic series of things following each other in certain paradigms that are wedded to certain modes of production. So he says that he puts all of these struggles, all of these different types of struggles that will be subdued by various institutions, he calls these all microfascisms. And he says quite finally that I use this term simply because it startles and annoys people, which is kind of funny that he just straight up says it. But he says that this raises an important theoretical question, a question that for me, Deleuze, and several others has changed somewhat lately. We thought the most formidable enemy was psychoanalysis because it reduced all forms of desire to the particular formation, the family. Right? This is their critique in Anti-Oedipus, that psychoanalysis reduces all desire to the Oedipal triangle and to a family-restricted approach. They want to see desire as something much more radical, something more expansive and social than that, not just familial. But, he continues, there is another danger, of which psychoanalysis is but one point of application. It is the reduction of all modes of semiotization. What I call semiotization is what happens with perception, with movement in space, with singing, dancing, mimicry, caressing, contact, everything that concerns the body. All these modes of semiotization are being reduced to the dominant language, the language of power, which coordinates its syntactic regulation with speech production in its totality. What one learns at school or in the university is not essentially a content or data, but a behavioral model adapted to certain social castes. right? So semiotization is a general way in which behaviors are re-territorialized onto a model that suits a certain mode of production. As such, he says that the great problem is this, that one cannot strive toward a political objective without identifying as well all the microfascisms, all the modes of semiotic subjugation of power that reproduce themselves through that struggle, and no myth of a return to spontaneity or to nature will change anything. In other words, all we have to do is move forward, and moving forward requires that we are very carefully self-aware of the latent tendencies which we carry within ourselves that might make it seem or feel like we are being really revolutionary when in fact we are being reactionary and we are merely being prey to the way that our thinking changes according to certain economic needs, for example. However naively, he continues, that one assumes to be innocent in this regard, whether in relation to our children, our partner, or our students, for professors, I believe that this innocence is equivalent to guilt and engenders guilt. The question is neither of innocence or guilt, but of finding the microfascism one harbors in oneself, particularly when one does not see it. So, what he wants to do here, and I think this is important, is not focus on engendering guilt, treating the revolutionary movement as if you have to stifle out the anti-revolutionary sentiments in the group. No, that has this overarching coercive force kind of ring to it, kind of like how Hobbes talks about the state. Instead, he says that what we must simply do is precisely identify the alliances and possibilities that exist concretely at the level of political struggles and which are completely different in nature. So we're acknowledging here that the possibilities for the future may be entirely different from one another, not wed to some common teleological goal of society, but in fact that different particulars which are related to concrete political struggles can have genuine change. And he mentions, for example, having a systematic attack on psychoanalysis, which they did in Anti-Oedipus. He says a sort of generalized suppression of what I call the semiotic components of expression takes place in a certain type of writing, such that even when people speak, they speak as if they were writing. At the same time, the rules of their speech not only depend on a certain syntax, but on a certain law of writing. And this law of writing can be seen as proper English, kind of Queen's English, right? When you're learning to write in school, when you're learning to speak, when you're learning to communicate, when you're learning to read, you learn certain grammar rules, certain pronunciation rules. For example, if you're from a kind of area where African American vernacular English is popular, and you go to a very affluent school, you may be treated as if your pronunciation is ghetto, or as if it's unclear, or as if it's unprofessional. This is a way of semiotizing the social field in a way that truncates it. There's always a subtle subtext being applied. He literally calls this a text that says, is it appropriate to make this gesture at this point? So always there is a certain code that is being applied. Now, it doesn't need to be a whole code. In fact, that's the point, is these codes are always partial. They've been created over time and thus have problems. He says the whole evolution of systems of enunciation tends toward the individuation of enunciation and toward the degeneration of collective arrangements of enunciation. In other words, it turns towards an individuation that separates people from the larger socius in which they are embroiled. But they're still implicated in and coded by that socius. They just can't trace back the elements to how they got to the place that they're at. In other words, he says, one moves toward a situation where the entirety of complex systems of expression, as in dance, tattoo, mime, etc., is abandoned for an individuation that implies the position of a speaker and an auditor, such that the only thing that remains of a communication is the transmission of information quantified in bits. Yet, in another arrangement, the essence of communication is a communication of desire. A child who plays or a lover who courts someone does not transmit information. He creates a richly expressive situation in which a whole series of semiotic components are involved. So we have two different ways of seeing behaviors show up socially. One of them focuses on coding communication through bits. In other words, this is a binarization. This is what they talk about in 1,000 Plateaus, where you have two definite responses, yes or no, and it's bound by either or thinking. To the contrary, this notion of communication of desire works by both and thinking, where we focus on what they call in anti-oedipus conjunctive syntheses. These are ways of continually adding to the momentum of the social system without having to negate that which doesn't add up perfectly to the codes that already exist. It allows for slippage and it allows for difference and genuine multiplicity without trying to constantly truncate and maintain and conserve the system. Thus, this is an anti-conservative approach. A good example that he gives is that today, shopping ideally demands that the salesperson behaves like a computer. Even if the salesperson is somewhat affable and displays all the iconic components of seduction, she nonetheless seduces according to a precise code. Her skirt must be a certain length, her smile artificial, etc. The best way for capitalism to ensure semiotic subjugation is to encode desire in a linear way. Whether in a factory or a bank, capitalism does not want people who bring the totality of what they are, with their desire and their problems. One doesn't ask them to desire, to be in love, or to be depressed. One asks them to do the work. They must suppress what they feel, what they are, their entire perceptive semiotics, all their problems. Right? Because these problems are messy. When he talks about coding in a linear way, what this means is that any decision always has a very definite binary outcome. It either increases or decreases productivity. It either helps or hinders public perception. All of these are very concrete metrics which require very straight line notions of progress, for example. If you have a goal and the goal is to reach that goal as fast as possible. But all of these desires of loving and being depressed, of feeling, and this perceptive semiotic that he speaks of, all of our problems, these are asked to be repressed. And in this way, repression acts as a way to subdue potential forms of aberrant behavior according to the system. And it individuates us into these binary sort of bits in a system. We're cogs in a machine. Now, Guattari adds some important nuance here. He says, I think the position of the subject and the object in the unconscious is one that continually implies not a metaphysical general subject, but a particular subject, a type of particular object in a definite socioeconomic field. This is a profoundly anti-Cartesian approach to what it means to be a subject, because for Descartes, one is a cogito, a thinking thing. This is a general subject category, specially made for humans, and everything else is things, are objects opposed to these thinking things. They are res extensia, extensive or extended things. And what Guattari wants to say here is that when we talk about the subject of the unconscious, of the subject of desire, for example, we're not talking about some metaphysical postulate, some sort of theoretical abstraction, but rather a continually implicated definite individual within a socioeconomic field, which is constantly trying to hierarchize, which is to say to impose order from the top down, organize, which is to say fit something into a very definite functional relation to other things, such that it is like an organ in the body with an desired input threshold between certain values and a certain output threshold according to the amplitude of that input. and also centralize, which is to say take the peripheries, take those which are outliers, and bring them towards the center, towards a sort of monotonous, stable baseline. He says that the national language is the instrument of translatability, which specifies each person's way of speaking. An immigrant does not speak the same way as a teacher, as a woman, as a manager, etc. But in any case, each is profiled against a system of general translatability. This is once again that notion of proper English. This is what that general translatability is. That this is an exemplary case of that hierarchization, organization, and centralization that occurs when we try to abstract the subject away. We make a cookie-cutter model in which, for example, the immigrant is seen as something errant that needs to be dealt with accordingly. But, he says, yet I am so talkative myself that I don't see how one could accuse me of denying language and power. It would be absurd to go to war against power in general. He says it would be absurd to oppose desire and power. Desire is power. Power is desire. What is at issue is what type of politics is pursued with regard to different linguistic arrangements that exist. So we're focusing on current linguistic systems that exist and the flaws in them. For example, it was traditionally assumed that the kind of standard English that we're taught in schools is grammatically and phonetically superior to African American vernacular English. But in fact, African American vernacular English has a number of deletions that it does. For example, oftentimes you can say she instead of she's, as an apostrophe S, she's, and it still make grammatical sense, and you've just truncated your sentence a little bit, made it quicker and more efficient, and still got exactly the same information across. You can do a number of deletions of such sorts, and you also have unique grammatical cases, like the habitual be, like I be going to the store, which is like I am habitually going there. I stay going to the store, right? That's another way of putting it. These tenses and ways of expression don't exist in normal English, and this is something that linguists have tried to focus on, is the fact that, well, our kind of standard English has its own limitations. It is actually not as concretely superior as we'd like to think it is. That there are different linguistic arrangements that do exist, and that different types of politics can make us move from one system to another. That desire and power and politics are all directly implicated in one another. He says that capitalist power injects a microfascism into all the attitudes of the individuals, into their relation to perception, to the body, to children, to sexual partners, etc. In other words, we are totally implicated and coded by capitalism. This does not mean we are totalized, that there is no way out, but it does mean that there was always a latent interest in coding the body, the mind, the family, the sexual instincts, for example. If a struggle can be led against the capitalist system, it can only be done, in my opinion, through combining a struggle with visible external objectives against the power of the bourgeoisie, against its institutions and systems of exploitation, with a thorough understanding of all the semiotic infiltrations on which capital is based. Consequently, each time one detects an area of struggle against bureaucracy in the organizations against reformist politics, one must also see just how much we ourselves are contaminated by them, are carriers of this microfascism. And calling it a carrier, that we are contaminated by it, there's a sort of parasitic viral language that's being implicitly used there or explicitly used there, which is important. It reminds me of William Burroughs talking of language as a virus. Once again, capitalism is a virus too in this way. And finally, Guattari gives a very explicit statement of his rejection of Lacan. One of the questioners asks, "Do you completely reject the system of knowledge elaborated by Lacan through linguistics and psychoanalysis?" Guattari responds, "Completely. I believe Lacan described the unconscious in a capitalist system, in a socialist bureaucratic system. This constitutes the very ideal of psychoanalysis. And the questioner asks, but is it valid as a system for describing this system? And Guattari says, well, certainly. Psychoanalytic societies, and this is why we pay them dearly, represent an ideal, a certain model that can have great importance for the other determinations of power in the universities and elsewhere, because they represent a way of making sure desire is invested in the signifier and only the signifier, in pure listening, even the silent listening of the analyst. It is the ideal of semiotic subjugation pushed to the highest expression. In other words, psychoanalysis has had historical evolution to get where it is and to make these a priori claims about the nature of the unconscious. This is what they say in anti-oedipus. That in fact, psychoanalysis in its understanding of neuroses, of fantasies, and phobias represents a way of making sure desire is properly invested in certain signifiers, such as the father, for example. This is something well known, and a lot of feminist theorists going against psychoanalysis or poking in holes of it, I'm thinking of Judith Butler in Gender Trouble, talks about the necessarily feminine exclusion that occurs in psychoanalysis, the focus on and privileging of the father, which is in fact a patriarchal norm, an axiom built into psychoanalysis. And that's why Guattari rejects it here, because Lacan described the unconscious in a capitalist system, and also, we might add, in a patriarchal system that represents an ideal for certain people in power. Thus, politics and theory are deeply implicated here, and thinking about a theoretical way out and a praxis for how to achieve that theory in reality requires reconciling with those microfascisms and with the necessary limitations of psychoanalytic discourse. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because I appreciate everything that people give to this channel. It means so much. And by the way, Merry Christmas to all who celebrate or who just want a good wish. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.